Attica was fear.
There was 70% black and brown prisoners, all white guards. What could go wrong?
Grab the guards, grab the keys.
All hell broke loose.
Tell me this, are these primarily blacks?
Guys were complaining about the basic things like toothpaste. A roll of toilet paper lasts you a month.
The inmates were considered like animals.
They beat you up in your cell and then they take you to segregation, and sometimes you don't come back.
Have the inmates made any demands?
There are all kinds of demands for change in the whole world.
This had to be mediated, otherwise it was going to end in disaster. They wanted to use those weapons.
Put your hands in the air and you will not be harmed.
You will not be harmed. You will not be harmed. But that was bullshit.
They want to kill us. We are men.
He was waking up America.
Somebody had to take a stand.
Welcome everyone to a very special discussion about the Spearing film and documentary Attica. I'm Paul Gardullo, curator and historian here at the National Museum of American History and Culture. Part of my work focuses on helping to collect and tell stories of race and incarceration at the National Museum by focusing our eyes clearly on matters of race and rights. Attica, which debuted in the fall of 2021, commemorating the 50th anniversary of the uprising and massacre in New York State, is a searing and vital work that provides a portrait of the late 60s and early 70s, but also one with deep relevance to our own times today, 50 years later, on matters of criminal justice and reform, race and racism, human rights, liberation movements, and state-sanctioned violence. But it also is about the power of storytelling, or more particularly truth-telling, the importance of memory, forgetting, and the shape of and continuing demands for justice. And so in the brief time we have today, we hope to touch on all these themes, and we have three powerful guides to help us do that. So let me begin with some short introductions. Filmmaker Stanley Nelson co-directed Attica. From Miles Davis' Birth of the Cool, to Freedom Riders and Freedom Summer, to Tulsa Burning, to Black Panther's Vanguard of the Revolution, to short films that he and his production team at Firelight Media made that sit within the museum's galleries, and once projected onto the very structure of the museum, Stanley is today's leading documentarian of the African American experience. Traci A is Attica's co-director and producer. He's a national award-winning director, producer, and writer for film and on multiple media platforms and networks. Traci founded and directs the production company Be Free Media, named to honor pioneering journalist Ida B. Wells, and her newspaper, the Memphis Free Speech, which was burned in 1892 following Wells' groundbreaking expose of lynching in the South. And James Asbury is a key voice and central presence within the documentary. He's 20 years old and serving 5 months in the prison on a parole violation when the riot occurred. Today, he lives in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, with his wife of 27 years, their daughter, and 3 grandchildren. He is retired from his work at a drug treatment center. Stanley, I want to begin with you. I wonder if you can help us briefly set the stage by providing a very brief overview of the focus of the story, of the uprising and massacre. And when you're doing that, let us know how and why you became interested in telling the story of Attica.
Attica is a prison in upstate New York. It's about 250 miles from New York City. And in 1971, the prisoners rebelled and took over the prison because of the horrible mistreatment that they were in the prison. They held the prison for 5 days because they had hostages, guards and civilian workers. And finally, the rebellion ended with a massacre of 40 prisoners, guards. I thought about making a film about Attica for a long time. I think that Attica, the story of Attica, tells so much about the prison system, tells so much about race in the States, tells so much of power of the government, the bravery of the prisoners to rebel. And it tells that story within kind of a 5-day contained story of a prison. So for a long time, I thought about making a film about Attica. And I think maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I realized that people involved in the story, the prisoners, hostage families, the reporters, the observer community, and we're getting old. And it was really kind of almost now and never. So we started trying to raise the money.
But Traci, I guess one of the things that interested me most is learning about how you first approached your research into this history. The archival footage is, to say the least, powerful. It is much more than powerful, and as I understand it, it was suppressed for years. In the way I look at it, it almost acts as a kind of powerful evidence, almost evidentiary in the film. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the process of discovery of the materials and the decisions behind what to include visually in the film from the historical period.
Yeah, well, we understood early on that obviously the media had gone inside of Attica. In many ways, that's why we're here, because we have all of these amazing images that were captured by members of the media that went inside at the request, by the way, of the prisoners who were in there. So we knew, for starters, that the network archives that were of the reporters that were inside the prison held all this material. We had a fabulous archival researcher, Rosemary Pretende, who worked on the project, who is just dogged and determined when it comes to uncovering footage. So it was really a matter of going back again to the network to get, as Stanley likes to say, everything that they had, talking to the reporters that you see in the film, Stuart Dan and John Johnson, about their personal archives, and just collecting as much as we could of what was filmed in and around the prison at that time. And the footage really falls into 3 sort of buckets. So there's that footage that came from the networks. There's also the black and white footage that you see that seems to be taken from the prison cells above D-Yard that see the activity that's going on during the rebellion, during the time the prisoners hold D-Yard, as well as that harrowing footage that you see on the 13th, the arrival of the helicopters, the shooting, the smoke. All of that was reported by the New York State Police, obviously not thinking that they were indicting themselves while they were reporting and collecting all of that material, more likely thinking that they were, building a case against the prisoners at that time. And all of that material is held in the New York State Archives. And so we were able to get access to that. And then finally, there are those chilling, disturbing images, the photographic images that you see after the retaking of the men being paraded undressed around D-Yard, the aftermath of the violence, the death, the destruction. All of those images were actually evidence. So as you see during the credits, there were several decades of lawsuits and litigations about what happened on the 13th. And it was pretty much led pro bono by a team of lawyers for decades, led by a woman named Liz Fink. Liz has since passed away, but she has an archive of all of the evidence. And I mean, I think we probably had a terabyte drive for her entire archive with all of that evidence, and included in that were photos also again taken by state police investigators, also with the understanding that they were building a case against the prisoners and not themselves, of the aftermath of what happened, and we were able to get access to that. So ultimately, I'd say we ended up with hundreds of hours of footage, which all of us, Stanley, myself, co-producer Sushana Dubray, Rosemary, went through over and over and over and over again, and really kind of brought to the cream of the crop of that footage, brought to the top the best of what we had, which is what you see in the film.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing to see, and it's incredible to hear the variety of archives that you needed to sort of dig up and tap for that. I mean, I think one of the things that struck me as you were just talking was the consciousness and the utilization of the folks who are incarcerated themselves and their savviness around media to invite media into the conversations right away. And I think that is, I think their voices and their agency in positioning themselves in early on is vital. And I think the way in which your production team, the producers, honored that and went back and sort of privileges and centralizes the voices of those at Attica at that moment is just as vital, right? And I wonder, for both you, Traci, and you, Stanley, how important was it to involve those first person voices, people like Mr. Asbury, in telling the story? Was that different for you than other projects? We always deal with interviews, but how might have this been different, and how much of that was part of the making?
Yeah, I mean, I think from the first moment, we felt that the film could be done without narration. So that was, one of the first decisions. Let's try to make this film without narration, and so that it means relying on the interview subjects a lot more and them telling a complete story. We had thought that we would interview historians, and actually Traci did interview, one historian, and he was great and stuff, and we put together a scene or two with the historian, but it seemed like, he was coming from a different world. He was talking about what he had studied, and James and the other prisoners and everybody else were talking about things that they had lived. And so that moment, we made the decision, okay, well, let's try to do this not only without a narrator, but without historians. And that's the way we made the film.
It makes for a kind of like this singular experience. It's multiple voices, but so powerful and immediate and real, especially when combined with that historical footage. Mr. Asbury, thank you so much for being with us here today and for your crucial voice in this film. So, could you tell us how you first became involved in the project? Did somebody call you up? And can you talk about what it was like to be interviewed and to relive these memories with the filmmaker?
I'm not quite sure if it was Traci that, was it you, Traci, that texted my wife or contacted her initially? That's how I got reintegrated into this process. She told me, well, she's always been kind of protective in terms of this particular experience in my life. And she was kind of like trying to read me to see how I would react to something pertaining to Attica. And I guess I was in a better space than I've ever been. And I told her, well, we'll talk. And from that point on, I guess we began the dialogue. And some days it was good, some days it wasn't so good. And what I kind of realized in terms of that self-inventory, self-examination is that I will probably live with this trauma for the rest of my life. And and pretty much in terms of getting to the other side of it is dependent on my participation in terms of trying to erase these skeletons and these ghosts that I experienced 50 years ago. So that's kind of like the decision I made, and then the rest is history.
And do you think that process,
an ongoing aspect of history?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And and obviously you need to be doing that in an environment where trust is built, and more than just implied. And I think, do you feel that you giving voice to this history in your own words has been helpful?
What has been my pleasure is that the truth is definitely being presented to people that always disregarded convicts, thinking that they deserved to be where they were at. But history, in terms of innocent projects and things of that nature, are slowly letting the public know that a lot of times it's just not the truth as is being presented. And I think Stanley and Traci did a remarkable job in terms of doing the overall thing. Some of the stuff that would probably would still have been hidden if not for these folks.
110%. And I want to come back to some of these things a little later, but since you talked about what it was like and the unique knowledge that people who are incarcerated hold, I wonder if you'd be willing to talk with us today about describing the atmosphere of those early days of the uprising from your perspective. Individuals coming together to erect shelters, to source food, build medical arena, hold elections for spokespeople. Was this, I think you talked about the humanity being stripped of people and people refusing to be dehumanized. What was going on there? Was there something of a realization of a kind of community that was withheld under the conditions that you were incarcerated under?
Well, I guess my best approach to that would be that regardless of what the human spirit presents, is there's always this thing about conformity and actually relying or relating on other people to kind of like sit a program or sit a picture in terms of what they're trying to portray. And believe it or not, convicts are not dumb. They have a sense of organization. They have a sense of trying to convey what is actually going on. A lot of times that ugly thing called suppression always kind of like overwhelms that process where people never get the clear picture. But at this point, in terms of the things that were going on within the country in itself, the movement in terms of civil rights, humane treatment, the need for better court processing in terms of people that were facing charges, or even the disease of addiction, which was still years to be kind of like eradicated and put into a category or profile that was appropriate, that would give people more access to treatment. All of these things were the concept in terms of what these guys were trying to do in Attica. They got together, got a committee, and it was sort of like the stronger personalities or the mentality that had that leadership quality that kind of like say we have to, because the media is going to be coming in, so we have to present a front where, we're not going to be put in a category of well, ignoramuses and things of that nature. We have to show a front that we're intelligent, we know what we're doing, we've been forced to do this based on the inhumane treatment that we've undergone since the inception of prisons, or whatever you want to call them. So in some aspects it was ad lib, but as it went on, it became a thing where people have to really see this. And so those that sought to like take back control of the institution sort of like also were conspiring, saying that some of this stuff was so relevant till they still wanted to suppress it. That's always been the issue about suppressing the truth.
Yeah, and it's interesting. The film conveys that incredibly well without somebody telling you that that's what's happening, right? I mean, it's evident that the struggle, the awareness on the part of people who are organizing the way that they're trying to adjust as threats arise, the way in which they're trying to position themselves and their causes, it's so evident. And I just want to say kudos again, because I think, the tendency, I think oftentimes is to have somebody there to explain what's going on. And what you did, I think, powerfully, Stanley and Traci, is trust in the subjects to tell their story and tell it powerfully. And what you did then is, in the result, is provide a really tight focus on the events themselves, the uprising, the negotiations with the Observers Committee, the brutal massacre, as you discussed it and described it in the film. It's the massacre and the aftermath of that is just hard watching. But it was, the way all of that was suppressed over time within a larger landscape, social, political, media. But that tight focus was a conscious choice by you as filmmakers, to keep it honed in on that place. And I wonder can you talk about that choice and what that meant? Because that's a little bit of a risk to kind of go with that choice, to not provide that broader context across time or make connections. I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it was kind of organic. We talked a lot about, kind of going outside the prison, and how the prisoners were raised, in New York City, kind of as opposed to life in the town of Attica, and those kind of things. And actually, some of the interviews talked about it. But as we started editing, it just really seemed like there was more than enough material about what was happening in this contained story, and that with the film that we wanted to make in the time that we had, we couldn't do all things, and so I think it worked out. Obviously, the decision to keep it there and keep it in that story, which is complicated enough as a story, so that we looked at it as that there's one thing going on in the yard. There's another thing that's going on right outside the yard with the hostage families, and there's the story of the town of Attica and the hostage family. Then there's the story of the governor of New York State, Nelson Rockefeller, and then there's the story of Richard Nixon and the fact that he's in Rockefeller's ear. So we thought that these kind of circles were as complicated a story as we can tell. It doesn't give it another 2 hours.
Yeah, I mean, I think the layers within layers, as you described, they kind of roll out on their own. And I think one of the layers that struck me was, espoused in a single quote in the film. And I think maybe it was made by L.D. Barkley. I can't really remember, but when he said, "We have concluded that if we cannot live as people, then we can at least try to die like men," right? And for me, not only is that an incredibly powerful statement on its own, and knowing the fact that he was murdered, but it also struck me how similar it was in its voicing to statements espoused by other liberation movements, from Malcolm X to the Black Panther Party to the basic calls for human rights of the Poor People's Campaign. I'm a man, right? That is in response to the sanitation workers' strike and that atrocity. I guess for you both, you've worked on films that have creatively looked at some of these other liberation movements, from Black Power to civil rights. And I wonder if you can provide some context here today about how the Attica Uprising both reflects and extends those movements for justice in this period, and maybe then also talk about how its legacy is different.
I think, although prisons like Attica and others are physically and geographically removed from society by design, so that the public isn't able to see and know what goes on behind those walls. The reality is that they're not disconnected from what is going on in the larger world outside, and that was certainly the case with Attica. As you mentioned, this is 1971. This is a highly visible and active time for rebellion and resistance and these voices calling for justice. And so many of the people who were inside Attica came from those communities. Many of them, those people were part of those movements, had done that work, were in the Black Panthers, had come back from Vietnam, were protesting against the war. You had groups like the Young Lords, you had groups like the Rebel Underground. And so those things were not disconnected to what was going on inside Attica. There were also people that once they got into prison became radicalized in this way and began to see their identity as a political identity as prisoners. And so this was a time, not just in Attica, but in prisons all around the country where there was a movement of organizing in prisons. I mean, these conditions that we saw the prisoners calling out in Attica were certainly not unique to Attica at that time. The racism, the violence, the being forced to labor and make slave wages, the censorship, the not being allowed to have religious freedom. And these were all things that prisoners throughout the country were organizing around at that time. So what was happening in Attica certainly was not disconnected in any way to those movements that were happening outside the prison. And I would also say that across time, what happened in Attica was not is not today disconnected from the movements that we see calling out many of those same things today. I always say that I can't separate the making of this film from the time in which we made it. It was the beginning of the pandemic. It was 2020. It was George Floyd. It was the protests. All of those things were quite literally happening outside my window. I mean, there were protests that went by my street. I live across the street from a hospital where I could see the worst results of what was happening with the pandemic. And so I think for me, yes, there was an awareness of the way that what happened in Attica was reflective of that time, but there also I was also very aware of the way that what happened and the story that we were telling is also synchronous of the time that we're in now. I think, these questions of how the state responds to resistance, righteous resistance, to violence and injustice with more violence, resonates from us from Attica to today. I think that we saw when the pandemic first broke out that people in prisons were left to get sick and die, as were incidentally the people that work for the state in those prisons. So there's that same resonance, again, across those 50 years of this call for recognition of humanity. So I think in all those ways, what happened in Attica not only was in conversation with and an extension of what was happening in the country at that time, but also in this time right now today.
I think also, one thing that you got to be clear about is that, there was something in the air back then, just like there was something in the air, now. That you didn't have to be part of the Black Panther Party or the Young Lords Party to know about the Black Panther and be influenced by it. Just like you don't have to have gone on a protest march against the killing of George Floyd or others to know about the protest and to know about that. So I think that it's almost like it's something that was part of just being in the air, that everybody knew about it. Everybody knew it was a time where so many people thought that the world, including the prison system, could and would change.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that what is so vital about this film is it connects the dots. It connects the dots historically, as you're talking about, but it also connects the dots forward to today, like Traci, like you just mentioned. And I think what one of the narratives in some ways or the legacies of Attica in some ways that your film is helping to undo is the erasure, right? I mean, in some ways it seems as if Attica and its relevance at the time and moving forward has been systematically erased in some senses from the popular imagination. Right? For many people, we think of it and we think of Al Pacino shouting a line that they don't understand. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the popular memory of Attica and how the suppression of this story helped inoculate these kind of movements that you're talking about that are burgeoning in this time period.
I mean, yeah, one of the things that I was really surprised about is the lack of knowledge or recognition of Attica by so many people. You know, there are kind of two classes of people. One, who knew about Attica in its broad outlines, but didn't know the details at all. And then two, a lot of younger people, we find they don't know anything about Attica. You say Attica, it's like, well, what is that? Is it a place? Is it a soft drink? Like what is Attica? They just don't know anything. And so that was one of the things that was really surprising. And I think for any group, the film is a real surprise and really shocking. It's still shocking to me.
Buddhist. Mr. Asbury, I wonder what stands out to you most about the significance of the Attica uprising 50 years on.
I was listening to Traci and Stanley and pretty much how they pose those things, and something just struck me, and it's from like a 12-step program, and it states that people became sick and tired of being sick and tired. So I think that was it. Also, the current situations that were ongoing in the communities at that time. We heard of the riots that were going on around the country about injustices and things like that. And they would throw up a community center and put a little bit of money in the community and things of that nature, but nothing really radically changed. There were still countless people, dependent on welfare. There were countless young men and women, for that fact, that were incarcerated and could not be family participants. There were just so many things that would frustrate the spirit until that, like I said, you became sick and tired of being sick and tired because every day was a struggle just to survive. And I'm not just talking about the criminal element that ended up incarcerated in these places. I'm talking about society as itself, people turning to other means of escaping the reality that they had to live on a day-to-day basis. Those are some of the things that I began to understand and began to see, and it makes you angry. It makes you frustrated. It makes you wonder where is there a positive outlet to all this stuff. We talk about education, but I don't know if anybody ever really experienced education in the inner city because there was inadequate supplies, inadequate materials for learning, and that's just the reality of those things that happen to a predominantly suppressed reality. And I'm not saying just black people and Hispanics were like in ghettos and things of that nature, but I think that we were the last ones to be addressed. And I think that was so unfair. So we're talking about humanity, we're talking about politics, because I think you mentioned not Reagan, but was it Nixon or Reagan? I can't remember now. It's been 50 years. But I do remember Nelson Rockefeller. Well, yeah. But getting back to that question, I think the frustration was mounting. People, they just said enough is enough. That's kind of what spearheaded the civil rights movement because, people were just sick and tired of being treated inhumane and less than a human being, but yet they contributed to society. They were, income taxes coming out of their checks, if they were getting checks. There was poor representation in terms of up north in terms of union participation, because certain people control all of that. And, just the control and the demand for what, and it was like if they gave you anything, it was like a charitable. They were doing you a favor. And you would, the view was that you were less than. And we forget history teaches that, they threw everybody out of Europe that were not contributors, and they ended up here in the United States. And once they had control, they did the same thing that was done to them. So it's just like, it goes around and it comes around, but those that it comes around to are the ones that suffer the most. If I answer that. You know what justice is all about. Who has the earning potential and who does not? If you have money, you can kind of like dictate what you want to see in terms of policies and all of that other stuff. Like a person like me, it matters, but it doesn't, because I'm not going to sell my soul or my spirit, because whenever I leave here, I'm the only thing leaving. I can't take that stuff. I can be a charitable, like, Rockefeller Foundation and, Vanderbilts and all that stuff, leaving things for people of that nature. But what did you do to get that? That's what I see. That's my truth. That's my awareness. What did you sell of yourself to be viable in terms of the economic aspect of life and living? Some people think it's worth it, some people don't. So I don't think it's worth it. Don't have nothing now, but I'm okay with me. If I'm answering that question based on my insight. I'm freer now than I've ever been, because I'm not trying to get to that utopic thing that they call you made it, in terms of the monetary stuff and all that kind of stuff. I'm okay in my skin, I'm okay in my spirit, and I'm okay up here. So, all I want to do is just help. That helps me.
Thank you. And you being here and you telling your story and your truth helps. Traci, I wonder if you could tell us what, from your perspective, what lessons or implications does this story have for the ongoing movements of justice today?
Yeah, Paul, in some ways I feel like the issues that the film grapples with are so intractable that I don't necessarily know that it offers us any easy answers to these complicated problems. But I do hope that it acts as an invitation for people to be curious about the system that we are living with today and that we are allowing in our name. I mean, the public is told that the system as it exists, this system, which, by the way, today incarcerates 2 million people, 22% of the world's prison population here in the United States, is what is required, right? Is what is necessary in order for us to be safe. And I think if we think about Attica, and particularly that shocking phone call that we hear between Richard Nixon and Nelson Rockefeller, the narrative that they're crafting to tell the public about what was necessary for them to be kept safe, which incidentally, there was never any chance that anyone was going to get out of DR, right? So that just wasn't even a possibility. But the narrative that they're crafting is that the killing of 39 people by the state is necessary because there is this unruly blackness that has gotten out of hand, and we must get it under control. That is the story that they're telling on that phone call, and that is the story that they want to sell to the American people about why that matters. So I think when we think about that in terms of today, certainly nothing on the level of a one-day, 2 minutes massacre of 39 people, but there is a way that the system does violence to all of these people. I think when most people think about prison and what they know, what they think they know about prison, they're really thinking about fictional accounts, right? Like most people are never going to have been inside of a prison, but they've seen enough movies and they've watched enough TV to think that they know, but they don't. And so what I would really hope is that this film is an invitation for people to get curious about the system that we have today and to really try to understand it and decide whether or not the violence and the harm that system does is really worth it, and whether it is accomplishing the safety that we are told is what we get in exchange for this very high cost that all of these people who are caught up in the system have to pay.
Yeah. And I think that inversion and that masking of the real violence of what was going on is so powerfully laid bare by this film. Stanley, what is Attica? What do you think Attica tells us about America?
I think it tells us a lot of things. I think one of the things that we easily forget about the Attica story is, how the former prisoners are telling their own story, and that you see the humanity in the prisoners, and that they are demanding that they just be treated like human beings, and that you see them as human beings. And we never stop to film and tell you that, but you see that, and you can't help but think about it. I think that it shows what I call the casual racism that exists in this country. From the guards, and when they retake the prison and law enforcement yelling white power, to Richard Nixon, one of his first questions, was it the blacks? And the President of the United States, Richard Nixon, says, were any white people killed? I mean, it's just an incredible indictment of where his mind's at and where the country's at. So I think the film says so many things about our country, and I think that's why, in some ways, the reaction to the film has been what it is.
I mean, I think it's got lessons that we're going to be trying to grapple with for a long time. James Asbury, Traci A, Stanley Nelson, I want to thank you, each of you and you collectively, for this incredible and important work, for putting your creative brilliance into this, and for putting your voices into making this and helping us remember. So with that, I just want to say thank you so much, and for being here to talk with us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul.
We appreciate the opportunity.
Attica was fear.
There was 70% black and brown prisoners, all white guards. What could go wrong?
Grab the guards, grab the keys.
All hell broke loose.
Tell me this, are these primarily blacks?
Guys were complaining about the basic things like toothpaste. A roll of toilet paper lasts you a month.
The inmates were considered like animals.
They beat you up in your cell and then they take you to segregation, and sometimes you don't come back.
Have the inmates made any demands?
There are all kinds of demands for change in the whole world.
This had to be mediated, otherwise it was going to end in disaster. They wanted to use those weapons.
Put your hands in the air and you will not be harmed.
You will not be harmed. You will not be harmed. But that was bullshit.
They want to kill us. We are men.
He was waking up America.
Somebody had to take a stand.